All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Fallen Flags America. I'm your host, L&M Productions. Uh, just before we start off, I want to apologize for the delay that we've had in getting the episode up. I know I I'm technically, what is today? Wednesday. About a day behind, but regardless. Let's get into the briefing. So, today on this episode of Fallen Flags America, we will be discussing the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, also known better as simply the Katy. So, here we see a trio of Jeep 40s and a Jeep 38 leading a manifest through, I believe it was taken in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken. Um, Numbers include MKT 207, 212, 170, all those three are G40s, and 338, a Jeep 38 AC. This picture was taken in 9/25, 1987 at St. Louis, Missouri. Don't know if don't know if the spot is still there, folks, but anyway, just thought I'd show you a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the episode. Uh, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, better known as the Katy, was a large grandeur that maintained an unconventional north south route with a region dominated by the Santa Fe, Missouri Pacific, and Southern Pacific slash St. Louis Southwestern, better known as the Cotton Belt. It was also forced to compete against the failing Rock Island Railroad and the St. Louis San Francisco Railway, the Frisco Railroad. In spite of this, the company suffered only one true bankruptcy as a result of financial hardship, which is quite impressive among railroads. As its name implies, the MKT connected with its namesake cities with key connections to St. Louis, Kansas City, Dallas Fort Worth, Waco, San Antonio, Galveston, and Houston. Much of its growth across Texas occurred during the Jay Guild era, one of the industry's most notorious tycoons. After escaping his grasp, Katy spent the 20th century as well managed, if not highly profitable railroad. Due to its regional nature and many competitors, it did not enjoy the success of its larger neighbors, but was nonetheless a respected carrier. During the late 1960s, legendary railroader John Bridger III took the reins and guided the Katy through a brief bout of prominence. He also envisioned it joining a stronger system, which came true in 1988 when it was merged with the Union Pacific Transportation Company, or Union Pacific Railroad Company. They can handle it. So here we see what appears to be a business train on the Katy with a pair of in the red dip a pair of red dip F7As, and they're all red with the MKT logo, with a business train at Labette, Kansas on October 4th, 1968. Mac Owen took his photos. A shout out to Mac Owen if you're watching this, and David Hawkins' collection. So, fantastic photo, Mac. Very good picture. Well documented. Um, the Katy story begins during the railroad's earliest days west of the Mississippi River. These vast lands remained relatively uninhabited during the mid 20th century, and the federal government looked to change this by aiding in the route's construction to the Pacific Ocean. This concept was first launched in the 1850s when then U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who later became President of the Confederate States of America, led surveying efforts for this purpose. The three primary corridors were chosen, one to the north, a central route, and finally a southern passage. For years, Congress could not agree upon philosophical which due to philosophical philosophical differences over slavery. However, following the Civil War's outbreak, a ununified Northern delegation declared upon the central option. Hostilities brought a much more urgent reason to build west, curbing Confederate influence within these regions. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on July 1st, was the most famous piece of legislation passed for this purpose. It also established the Union Pacific Railroad to build from Omaha, Nebraska, which would meet the Central Pacific heading east from Sacramento. Following 6 years of construction, the two met at Promontory Summit, Utah, during a formal ceremony held on May 10, 1869. With the driving of the Golden Spike that day, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. While this event may be the best remembered, a number of similar projects were also undertaken around the same time. The Northern Pacific was later established to build from the 49th parallel, while the Texas Pacific Railroad, predecessor to the Texas and Pacific Railway, was tasked to run via the 32nd parallel, never completed. In addition, other upstarts like the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Atlantic and Pacific, the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, whose charter was acquired by the ATSF, and the Kansas Pacific, later would become the Union Pacific, were awarded land grants to open the West. Here we see another picture of a Katy train. PA number 155C, which appears to have the fort section of the Blue Bonnet somewhere in Texas circa 1957. The Alco PAs, which this one is a rare version, the PA2, came in their own unique livery. They were in the gold and yellow with the red paint, and it was a very pretty locomotive in general. Interesting, the Katy's intermediate predecessor also enjoyed such land grants, although much of its network was ultimately pieced together, though either way, either new construction or acquisition. It all began when President Lincoln signed and amended the Pacific Railroad Act into law on March 3, 1863. This legislation, according to the booklet, The Opening of the Great Southwest, A Brief History of the Origin and Development of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, released by MKT's Publicity Department in 1970, stated the government would grant alternate sections of land along the route to aid in construction of a line down the Neshoho Valley to the southern boundary of Kansas. These would be 10 sections in width along each side of a track. The book, Katy Power, Locomotives and Trains of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, 1912 to 1985, by authors George Colalis and Raymond George Jr. Notes the government had another motive behind this plan, to provide U.S. Army forts with improved transportation as a national defense measure against the Confederacy. More specifically, it was hoped that Fort Riley, Fort Leavenworth, and Fort Gibson would be directly connected by rail. There were 3 railroads incorporated for this purpose: the Kansas and Neshoe Valley Railway, the KN&B, the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Fort Gibson Railroad, the LL and FTG, and finally the Union Pacific Railway Southern Branch, UPRSB. The latter formed during February of 1865 as Katy's genesis and envisioned to link all 3 forts, as well as Fort Smith in Arkansas, never accomplished. The first to complete this task and reach Indian Territory, the state of Oklahoma, after November 16, 1907, would be declared the winner. Here we see an interesting consist of power on this train. We see an assortment of Katy Power led by Alco FA1 number 85C at the NEY Yard in Fort Worth, Texas during March of 1968 in the David Hawkins collection. It wasn't long before promoters of the LL and FTG had given up, which left only the N and YV, later reorganized as the Missouri River, Fort Scout and Gulf, and the UPRSB. The former began construction directly out south of Kansas City, while the latter commenced from Fort Riley, Kansas, Junction City, in a southeasterly direction. Both companies were soon underway, and the UPRSB have reached Burlington, Kansas by February of 1870. Just 3 months later, on May 23rd, it was renamed as the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, the MK&T, which is where our story begins. Shortly thereafter, track layers arrived in Chetopa, Kansas, 182 miles from Junction City, Kansas, and the first train officially entered Indian Territory on June 6, 1870. There was great dismay when it was learned that the MRFT, FT, and SG had actually arrived there first, completing a line down the eastern edge of Kansas, connecting Fort Scott, Garrett, Columbus, and Baxter Springs along the way. However, by doing so, it had entered Quahapa Indian Territory, which was not stipulated in the federal act, which specifically stated a railroad was to enter the Necho River Valley within the Cherokees' lands. As a result of the MK&T was awarded the grant. Here's the logo of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railway, known as the Katy. With more capital now available, officers immediately sought further construction and opened a new 160-mile corridor from southeastern Kansas to Sedalia on February 3, 1871. It split off the original main line at the new town of Parsons, named for the MK&T president Judge Levi Parsons. The location later became the modern Katy's primary engine and maintenance terminal. After opening to Sedalia, construction crews worked their way south, crossing the Red River, and reached Denison, Texas, on December 24, 1872. Many of the railroads building west, which included the powerful Santa Fe Railroad, were funded by Eastern capitalists based either in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia. The Katy was no different, and it relied heavily on their monetary support early on. It struggled to procure a steady traffic base due to the region's sparse population. It subsisted chiefly on the Chisholm's Trail cattle business, which helped fuel the Santa Fe's rapid growth along with available agricultural traffic. In an effort to remedy this issue, it opened a through extension from Sedalia to Moorville, Missouri, on January 10, 1874, following completion of a bridge over the mighty Missouri River. The new line provided a connection with the St. Louis, Kansas City, and Northern, a predecessor to the Wabash Railroad, which offered through service into the growing hub of Chicago. So this is a map of the Katy. It doesn't say when this. 1931. Following the financial panic of 1873, the MK&T did its best to remain solvent, but eventually entered bankruptcy on December 31st, 1874. It exited receivership on March 1st, 1876, carrying the same name but with new leadership. A confidant of J. Guild, William Bond, was later named general manager, which led to the tycoon himself later achieving the presidency on January 26, 1880. He implemented his typical procedures of deferred maintenance and pay cuts to provide shareholders with the highest possible earnings. Despite his poor reputation, Guild was credited with much of the Katy's expansion. Growth was a key step in his larger plan to establish a true coast to coast transcontinental railroad, and explains why most railroads under his control rapidly expanded in the late 19th century. In the Katy's case, its development was somewhat different, as Guild used the carrier to further propagate his influence across Texas. By the end of that year, he enjoyed a virtual monopoly in the Lone Star State thanks to a portfolio that included the Missouri Pacific, Texas and Pacific, which would later be merged into the Missouri Pacific, and International and Great Northern Railroad. By acquiring the MP, Guild made a corporate change with the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. Henceforth, it would be the MK&T division of that system. It was abbreviated to K&T Division, and printed timetables was led to the nickname KT or Katy. Here we see a MKT SD40-2, number 632, rolling through a small grade crossing at Chihotu, Oklahoma on September 18, 1983. Afterwards, he quickly pushed it deeper into Texas in early 1881. Guild purchased two small short lines running south and west of Denison. One reached Greenville, while the other terminated at Gainesville. Then trackage rights were secured over T&P on April 1st, providing access into Fort Worth from Whitesboro. 1880s were a banner decade for growth. From Greenville, the line was extended to Magnolia on June 25, 1881. Service into Dallas also began in that year by controlling the Dallas and Wichita Railroad. Beyond Fort Worth, rails reached Taylor on June 9, 1882. Another small short line, the Dallas and Greenville Railway, was picked up in 1886 following direct service between those 2 points. In 1890, the subsidiary Dallas and Waco reached Hillsboro, which opened through service from Dallas to Waco and Taylor and points further south. In 1887, an extension reached Henrietta along a corridor that eventually became a long agricultural branch into western Oklahoma. Houston was assessed in 1983, and the MK&T entered Galveston by jointly owning the Galveston, Houston, and Henderson in conjunction with the International and Great Northern. Lastly, it arrived in San Antonio from the east in 1901, then opened a direct north-south connection from Granger to Austin in 1904. Beyond San Marcos, trackage rights were secured over the IGN into San Antonio. Here we see a pair of Katy E8As in Atlanta Union Station, likely run-through power on a train heading back west. The company wrapped up its extension in Texas by acquiring the Texas Central Railway in June of 1910. This 268-mile system provided service into Dillon, Cross Plains, and Rotan via Waco. While Guild never focused on further growth across Indian Territory, he did establish a direct route into Kansas City. Much of this was accomplished in 1887 when a new line from Parsons to Panolia was built. From there, 43 miles of trackage rights were secured over the Kansas City, Fort Scott, Memphis Railway, that would later become part of the Frisco, on June 8, 1889, before Guild could carry out further efforts. A court order which forced him to divest control of the MK&T. It took effect on November 1, 1888, in which time the Katy was prominently separated from Missouri Pacific. It was placed into a voluntary receivership and reorganized as an independent Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway on July 1, 1891. Following this corporate shakeup, the MK&T continued to expand. It reached St. Louis in the spring of 1894 by completing a line from New Franklin to Matchins, 162 miles, then gained trackage rights over CB&Q from that point into the Gateway City. Just a year later, in 1895, it opened a 86-mile cutoff from Bryson to Panolia, following a direct east-to-west corridor between St. Louis and Kansas City. A trio of KCS G40s have a freight at the terminal yard at Parsons on August 3rd, 1975. That was only a day before my birthday, fun fact. The Katy's final additions included a route to Oklahoma City and the extensive previously mentioned agricultural branch across western Oklahoma. The former was attained over a long 169-mile branch running southward from Coffeeville, Coffeeville, completed in February of 1904. Of note was a sort of cutoff that was established between this branch and the Kansas City, St. Louis, Dallas to Fort Worth main line when a 79-mile connector opened from Osage to Wabark in August of 1903. The latter was carried out through a series of leases and new construction. First, the MK&T leased the Wichita Falls Railway in 1895 to access Wichita Falls, Texas, from what was then the end of trackage at Heneria, I think. In July 1901, it acquired the Wichita Falls and Northwestern Railway, which is already in progress of opening rail service throughout western Oklahoma. It reached Forgan on November 1st, 1912, which have followed the competition of a branch from Alsace to Wellington, Texas, on November 10th, 1910. Altogether, this trackage totaled 363 miles. In 1931, the line was further extended from Forgan to Keys by acquiring the 105-mile Beaver, Meade, and Inglewood Railroad. The Katy's entire interest in this trackage was to improve its wheat and cotton tonnage. However, as the years passed, the branch became increasingly unprofitable and was abandoned north of Alstrus in January 1st, 1973. Here we see an F7 number 75C and another Jeep. Looks like a GP30, leads a long freight at South Wichita Falls, Texas, during February 1966. Credit goes to Bill McCoy for this photo and is part of the Warren Callaway collection. So if either of you are watching this, thank you for this unique photo. There were many other components of the comparatory Katy not mentioned here. Many were short segments, either abandoned or sold over the years. One of the most notable was the narrow gauge East Line and Red River Railroad, EL and RR, acquired on November 28, 1881. According to Dr. George Hilton's book, American Narrow Gauge Railroads, the system was originally chartered in March 22, 1871, and just over the next decade opened 124 miles from Greensville to Jefferson, Texas. Following the MK&T's takeover, it was extended westward from Greensville to McKinney in May of 1882. Due to a dispute with the Texas Attorney General, the EL and RR was ordered separated from the MK&T on April 12, 1891, although it remained under Katy control. The process of converting the property to standard gauge began in 1887 when the newer McKinney-Greenville section was widened. The remainder was finished during a single day, 122 miles, on September 13, 1892. It was then pushed eastward to Loscombe, Texas, while 20 miles of trackage were secured over the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Pacific, future component of the Illinois Central in 1900 to reach Shreveport, Louisiana. It only remained in the MK&T network for 2 decades. On September 26, 1915, the Katy was placed in receivership when it was reorganized on April 1st, 1923, as the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad. The EL and RR trackage was not retained and became part of the Louisiana Railway Navigation Company, which would later become the Kansas City Southern. Throughout the 20th century, the 2,787-mile Katy enjoyed strong leadership, although stiff competition hampered profits. It managed to evade bankruptcy during the Great Depression thanks in part to a nearly $3 million Reconstruction Finance loan received in 1938. Mr. Cahalas and Mr. George Jr. agreed that the MKT elected to enter receivership during these lean times. It may ha- argue that had the MKT elected to enter receivership during these lean times, it may have decreased or eliminated outstanding debt, improved its system, and enjoyed greater success. As it were, the lack of money procured heavier infrastructure and equipment investments. Much of its network was laid in relatively light rail, 90 pounds or less, which prevented more powerful wheel arrangements such as 2/8 bores, 4/8 bores, or articulateds from being utilized. Without these, it could not handle larger freights, which would have generated greater revenue. In May of 1948, the MKT did unveil Beautiful Streamliner, the Texas Special, in conjunction with the St. Louis San Francisco Railway between St. Louis and Dallas Fort Worth and San Diego. Unfortunately, MKT's deteriorating track conditions and equipment greatly vexed the Frisco, which canceled its leg in 1859. Locomotive types they rostered included 6 PA1s, 8 PA2s, 18 FA1s, 1 FA2, and 15 RS3s. These will later be rebuilt as RS3Ms, which I will show you a picture of those in a minute. They are pretty ugly. Baldwin products include the DS44-1000. They had 11 of these, 15 S12s, 18 AS16s, which are a rare locomotive, 6 SW1200s, 6 SW1500s, 4 MP15ACs, 2 E7As, 4 E8As, another 3 E8As, another 2 E8As. All these were built in 1950 and 51, respectively. 8 FP7s, 79 GP40s, 14 F3As, 7 F3Bs, 4 F7As. Okay, let's see here. 4 times 2 is 8. And 8 times 2 is 12. So I think that's about 4 F7As in total. All those being built in 1949. I don't know why they didn't put them all together, but whatever. And then 8 F7Bs, 4 F9Bs, 4 G38s, 18 GP38-2s, 20 GP39-2s, another 9 which were purchased from the Conneaut Copper Company, 37 SD40-2s, and then they had another one that was rebuilt in 1979. So it was not the oldest, but one of the oldest. 5 NW12s, 10 SW9s, and 34 GP7s. Fairbanks Morse include one 81644 Trainmaster built in 1950 and another 4 ordered in 1951. More specifically, they were built in that would be October, and then they ordered another batch that were delivered in October to so that's September and October of 1951. General Electric, they rostered 3 U23Bs, 1 U25 tonner, and 4 70 tonners. Wickham Locomotive Works, they rostered one 12 tonner and 1 25 tonner. So that covers this episode of Fallen Flags of America, which covers the rise, success, and fall of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. But until we meet again somewhere out there in the high iron, this is L&M Productions.